Okay, great. Good morning. This meeting of the Atlantic Menhaden Management Board is now in session. I'm Delaware Administrative Commissioner John Clark. I'll be chairing this meeting. I'm joined here up front from ASMFC by Plant Coordinator James Boyle, Katie Drew, our Stock Assessment Scientist, and we have guests from the USGS, Dave Zilkowski and Barnett Ratner, who will be giving a presentation later. We have a very full agenda, not a lot of time, so we will get right down to it. The consent items, are there any changes to the agenda? Seeing none, the agenda is approved. Are there any corrections to the proceedings from the April 2024 meeting? Seeing none, the proceedings are approved. Now we move on to public comment for items that are not on the agenda, and a reminder that both the Osprey issue and the Chesapeake management issue are on the agenda. Do we have comments for items not on the agenda? I see one hand here. Is that Mr. Zalzek? And this is for an item not on the agenda, Phil.
All right. Just before I get started here, is John Clark the chairman of this committee? All right, Mr. Clark. My name is Phil Zalzak. I'm a spokesman for the Save Our Menhaden Coalition. The coalition is demanding an end to localized depletion of Atlantic menhaden in the Chesapeake Bay and its entrance. Simply capping the reduction harvest in the Chesapeake Bay to an unscientific quota and ignoring the entrance to the bay is irrational, ineffective, and violates common sense. As a U.S. citizen with family in both Maryland and Virginia, I'm proposing a solution which is proven to be effective in eliminating localized depletion of Atlantic menhaden. I'm requesting that you and members of the Delaware delegation put forth a motion to end purse seine fishing in Virginia waters, just as your legislature did in Delaware in 1984. I'm also requesting that the motion be seconded by a New York delegation whose legislature took the same action in 2019. Since 2019, striped bass recreational harvest in New York has increased by 50%, from 7 million to 10.5 million. Since 2019, the New York for-hire recreational business has increased, and whales, predator fish, birds have returned to New York waters in abundance. This has been documented in a 2-minute video produced by Tim Reagan, a fishing guide and professional videographer. This action is supported by the latest science as documented in the ERP assessment of 2019, is supported by the latest empirical data provided by NOAA, will not impact Virginia quota, will not impact omega proteins reduction harvest quota by 1 fish, will end bycatch of important recreational fishing in Virginia waters, and will end fish spills in Virginia beaches. The current situation is an ecological and economic disaster for both Maryland and Virginia. According to the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, the striped bass juvenile young of year index has decreased from a long-term value of 11 to 1. According to NOAA, since 2016, the striped bass recreational harvest in Maryland and Virginia has decreased by 72%, from 11.9 million pounds to 3.4 million pounds. According to the Southwick Associates study of 2016, Maryland and Virginia striped bass recreational GDP was over $900 million and responsible for over 11,000 jobs. What is the economic loss in GDP and employment of a 72% reduction in striped bass recreational harvest in Maryland and Virginia waters? $500 million, 5,000 jobs? It's time to take action. End purse seine fishing in Virginia waters now. That's exactly what Delaware and New York did. Nothing more, nothing less. And it worked. Mr. Chairman, be a leader and save the bay. You can do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zalzek. That concludes our public comments, and we will now move on to item number 4, which is review a report from the U.S. Geological Survey on osprey data in Chesapeake Bay. And we have to present Dave Zilkowski and Barnett Ratner from the USGS. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Clark. It's our pleasure to be here today. Barnett and I will be trading off as we present slides to you here. It's not typical for me, but I'm going to follow some notes to keep myself on schedule here because we have a lot of information to cover in a very short period of time. So as Mr. Clark said, we're from the U.S. Geological Survey, which is a bureau within the Department of Interior. We're often called the science arm of the department. That's a bit of a misnomer because some of our sister bureaus like Fish and Wildlife Service also have science capability. But what makes USGS unique is that we're a non-management, non-regulatory agency that's solely dedicated to providing objective and impartial science to resource managers like yourselves and the public. Next slide, please. Barnett and I work at the Eastern Ecological Science Center, specifically at the Laurel, Maryland campus, but we have two other campuses as well, and those are in Kearneysville, West Virginia, and Turners Fall, Massachusetts. But as you can see from the green on the map here, we have staff located through many states. Our center has broad and diverse science capabilities, which you can see listed on the slide here, and we're recognized the world over as leaders in fish, wildlife, and associated ecosystem science. But among the work that we do, we're probably most prominently known for our migratory bird science. We house two of the world's largest wildlife surveillance programs, those being the North American Breeding Bird Survey and the Bird Banding Lab. And we also have a great many long-term bird studies, including a collaborative study working on osprey in the Chesapeake Bay region for over 50 years. Next slide, please. So most of you are familiar with osprey, and you've probably seen them before. They're a large day hunting raptor that's found on every continent except for Antarctica. They're loud, they're conspicuous, they tolerate human activity relatively well, and so not surprisingly, they're one of the world's best studied birds of prey. Their wingspan is about the same as mine, so pretty big bird there. They weigh just under 4 pounds. They're a long-lived species. Most adults can look forward to living up to 10 years. They're often called the fish hawk, which is a really fitting name because their diet is almost wholly consisting of fish. And in particular, they go for a certain size of fish. Most of them are about a foot long, sometimes a little bit less, and they weigh about as much as a small can of soup, so just under a pound. Osprey plunge dive for their food, and they take food within the first 3 feet of the water column just under the surface there. They can be found in pretty much any aquatic habitat, coastal wetlands, bays, rivers, lakes, mangroves, just about any habitat that has shallow water and the right size fish. And as you can see from the map here in North America, they occupy these northern reaches, and northern populations start heading south as the waters cool, and then they will travel sometimes thousands of miles down to subtropical and tropical areas. Next slide, please. So we're very fortunate here in the Chesapeake Bay region. We live in what's called the Osprey Garden, oftentimes because it's the home of the greatest number of breeding pairs of osprey in the world. So here's just a quick look at the phenology of these birds in our area. Birds start arriving in the Chesapeake Bay around St. Patrick's Day each year, and many of them have traveled thousands of miles from their wintering areas. Probably feels like thousands of years. Thousands of miles from their wintering areas in the Caribbean and northeastern South America, and they've expended a lot of energy, so their first order of business is to start feeding to get their bodies up to breeding condition, and then they start doing courtship activities, and they start nest building. So their nests are these enormous, magnificent structures built of sticks, and in historical times, those would have been erected in natural structures like trees, but now in modern times, they're using channel markers, cell phone towers, utility poles, artificial nest platforms, and you name it. So by late April, most females begin laying up to 4 eggs. They're speckled brown, and they're about the size of a large chicken egg. Females do most of the incubation, and unlike songbirds, they start incubating once they've laid the first egg. And this gives an advantage to the first chick, which Barnett will talk a little bit about in a few minutes. And then come June, the eggs are hatching, and the parents stay close to the nest for about a month, helping the chicks thermoregulate and protecting them from predation. And then by late July, in the Chesapeake region, the young have grown to just about adult size, and they start exercising their flight muscles in preparation for fledging. And fledging is when a chick takes a voluntary movement off of the nest to begin its life outside of the nest. So for weeks after they fledge, they hang out with parents and they perfect their hunting techniques, and they learn how to acquire food. And then they start departing the bay in September and start heading south again for their multi-thousand-mile journey to the south. Next slide, please. So osprey, being a very long-lived species and on the top of the food chain, they're very susceptible to the bioaccumulation of contaminants. And in North America in the 1950s and 60s, osprey populations started declining rapidly due to the effects of organic fluoride pesticides like DDT. And it's estimated that the Chesapeake Bay probably lost about half or more of its population at that time. And partly in response, if you could go back, please. All the way back. There you go. Thank you. Partly in response, the North American Breeding Bird Survey was formed in 1966 to start measuring bird populations across the continent at that time. So the BBS is a federal program that's jointly coordinated by the U.S. Geological Survey at the Eastern Ecological Center, Science Center, and Environment also partnered with Environment Canada. And the BBS provides the definitive record of large-scale long-term bird population change since 1966. So it uses a statistically rigorous, scientifically credible bird survey methodology that samples along predetermined roadside routes each year at the height of the breeding season. So what I'm going to do in this slide is I'm going to cover a lot of information, but I'm going to walk you through it, and I'm going to reveal some of the results of the North American Breeding Bird Survey. So here you can see population growth is on the left-hand side, and it's increasing to the right. So between 1966 and 2022, the eastern population of osprey increased by about 300%. Advance, please. And then in the Atlantic coast, where you can imagine abundance is even higher, the population increased by about 587%. And advance again, please. And then in the Chesapeake Bay region, it's increased by about 1,800% since 1966. Now you can see here that these blue routes are BBS routes and that this sampling is not entirely thorough in the area. So this estimate of 1,800% should be given a little less confidence than the other ones, just because the BBS methodology is not optimized for sampling very localized areas such as the Chesapeake Bay. But it's still informative. And what these numbers bear out is that osprey have made an astounding recovery by all accounts. The numbers are now in excess of historical numbers, and in part that's because they've returned to a world that's very different than the world was before they started declining. There's more suitable nesting structures, water may be cleaner, etc. If you hit advance again, please. Thank you. This graph here on the y-axis is an index to abundance, so low abundance down low and high abundance up high, and time is on the bottom there, shows you what such a great increase in population looks like over time. Pretty tremendous climb there. But if you look on the right-hand side of this graph, you'll know something's going on in recent years. If you advance again, please. We'll take a closer look at this period of time. This is 2012 to 2022. So in the lower left-hand corner of that yellow section there, what you see is you'll see a line marked by 0. Everything to the right of that is population growth. Everything to the left of that is population loss in that 11-year interval there. So the top figure there, that negative 8.8%, is the trend estimate from BBS during that time period. And as I said, it doesn't operate very well at small scales. So you can see the confidence intervals there are pretty wide and they cross 0. And that's telling us that we don't have enough statistical power to really say that that estimate is different from 0. However, there is a bird program that collects recreational observations from birders, and that's called eBird. It's run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and they've started to produce trends from their pool of recreational birding observations. And you can see those trends here. They're from Maryland is the second down, and Virginia is the third down there. And you can see they're both estimating a loss here, and the confidence intervals don't cross zero. So suggesting that the population is declining in that time period in the Chesapeake Bay region. Advance, please. So one great thing about eBird is you can actually bear down and look at the count data to see where exactly those counts are changing. And what you see in this figure here is the state of Maryland, Virginia below it. And you can see very large circles all around the Chesapeake Bay, very small circles to the left of it. That tells you that there's very high abundance. Larger circles are higher abundance in the Chesapeake region. Dark red indicates the greatest amount of change in the counts over that time period. But care must be used when you're interpreting these kinds of results. And to understand what I mean, it's helpful to look at osprey trends across the country for perspective. Advance, please. So here, I'll point out three things that I hope you take notice of in these graphs. On the left-hand side here, for example, California and Washington, opposite coast, you can see that there's something going on in the same time period as there is here in Maryland, Virginia, and the Chesapeake Bay region. Another thing to notice here is that in some of these graphs, even during the long-term increase, there are periods where there's short-term decline. And so if you were to focus on those areas of short-term decline, not knowing what's coming to the right of it, you might feel like your population is in a full-scale nosedive when in fact it's just having a perturbation over time. That's something to keep in mind. And then lastly, populations don't grow forever. We know this ecologically, and at some point density dependency factors kick in, and resources, be that food or territories, nest platforms, etc., become limiting, and populations tend to level off to what's called the carrying capacity. And sometimes populations overshoot their carrying capacity and then have adjustment period to come back down. But one thing I wanted to point out on the right-hand side here is that when populations plateau off, like Florida, for example, here, whose population underwent some growth, but has, by most suggestions, leveled off now since prior to 2002. That leveling period, that plateau, is very uneven, and there's a lot of perturbations that can happen during that time. So this information from these large-scale indices, it can be very informative, but really the gold standard for local population monitoring is to work with local census data, which are trying to completely enumerate a population. And that's where Barnett is going to pick up. Next slide.
Sure, next slide, please. So there have been two major surveys of the distribution and abundance of breeding ospreys in the Chesapeake. A 1973 aerial survey in association with some intensive ground surveys of nests with ospreys present indicated that the population was about 1,450 pairs in the 1973. And this was during really the height of the DDT use era. In 1995 and 96, a boat survey of tributaries with some aerial survey components was undertaken and revealed that the population had more than doubled, that is the population of breeding pairs, up to almost 3,500. And by the year 2020, it was estimated that there were 11,000 nesting pairs of ospreys in the Chesapeake. Next slide, please. Ospreys, as Dave mentioned, are nearly strictly piscivorous. If a fish species is abundant, the right size, and catchable, it's eaten. A great deal is known about the energy requirements during osprey nesting, with males foraging daily during daylight hours for more than 3 hours, traveling as much as 5 to 10 miles to catch fish and to bring them back to the nest to provide its mate and young in the nest. Provisioning depends on the number of young in the nest. Next slide, please. For ospreys, what is eaten depends on where they are nesting in the Chesapeake. A snapshot of foraging activity can be gleaned from studies conducted in 2006, 7, 11, 12, and 2013. Catfish and gizzard shad in low salinity tributaries and in the upper bay estuarine areas are the principal foods, at least during some of those study years. It's striped bass and menhaden in the mid-bay where there is moderate salinity. And it's sea trout and menhaden, again as a snapshot, in the lower bay in high salinity areas. Next slide, please. Data summarized by Watts and Paxton during the recovery from the adverse effects of DDT documented an increasing reproductive rate for ospreys in the Chesapeake. And it's generally accepted that the rate for maintenance of a stable population is about 1.15 young fledged per active nest, an active nest being a nest in which an egg was laid. Next slide, please. Prey abundance is a major factor that drives the osprey reproductive rate. When prey is abundant, the size of chicks is generally symmetrical as portrayed on the left side of that slide. Chicks hatched at different days, but well into incubation, they're all about the same size because there's plenty of food. However, when food is limited, a dominance hierarchy is established with sibling aggression and actual brood reduction, which is kind of portrayed on the right, that smaller chick compared to its larger siblings. Next slide, please. As you likely know, in the lower Chesapeake, the osprey reproductive rate has been reported to be well below the threshold to maintain a stable population for a number of years, particularly in the Mojack Bay area, that is viewed as a demographic sink. And this is work that has been conducted by Brian Watts' students and co-workers. Next slide, please. It's important to keep in mind that there are many factors and stressors that can affect osprey reproduction. Yes, limited food availability can have effects on reproduction, as well as depredation, competition, disease events, inexperienced breeders. There can be storms, weather events, and even very hot weather like we've experienced this year that can affect reproduction. Certainly environmental contaminants and also water clarity that's needed actually for the males to catch their prey. Next slide, please. We have identified some important information needs and data gaps related to ospreys in the Chesapeake. Specifically, the relation between osprey abundance and reproduction with factors like abundance and reproduction of their prey, potential shifts in fish community composition, and population trends not only in ospreys but in other high trophic level feeders, fish-eating birds, striped bass, and bluefish. More detailed information on the relation between salinity, osprey diet, brood provisioning, and demography are also needed. And perhaps fisheries independent data on prey fish abundant, age, and class size structure. Next slide, please. This year, we in the USGS are working with collaborators of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the College of William and Mary, and others to study osprey productivity and prey being brought to their nests in the lower bay and in the Patuxent River, Poplar Island, and in the Choptank River vicinity. I think we'll stop at this point, and Dave and I will be glad to entertain any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting and informative presentation, Dave and Barnett. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, so got Dennis Abbott and followed by David Borden.
Zukowski and Mr. Ratner for your informative presentation. I think we today at the board are being asked to look at this in a manner of a similarity between what was a canary in the mine. Is the osprey in the bay tied into a lack of menhaden? So we're being asked to believe that lack of menhaden is the cause and we should be taking action. And I do say that we can see what's going on physically with the osprey, but we can't see what's going on under the water with the health of the menhaden. So if we're to use, can we with some assurance use your studies to tie into a lack of menhaden in the bay at this point in time? It's kind of, I think that's what we're being asked to do. And so I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Yeah, that's a tough question. And in some areas, it may be a lack of menhaden, but as I showed in a couple of the slides, menhaden aren't in the diet in some regions of the bay. And some of the work we're doing this year, just at a data collection stage, is really looking at what's being brought to the nest by the adult male, and also pulling together information. And there may be some issues with menhaden populations in some parts of the bay, and it could even be some other species that are dependent on menhaden in other parts of the bay.
Go right ahead, Dennis.
Yes, thank you. In your presentation, you showed us that there was a 299% increase in the population of osprey. That seems counter to the fact that there's a lack of menhaden or adequate food supply in the bay with 11,000 pairs nesting there. Would they not be seeking other places to live if the food situation was so bad?
The response of populations to stressors is often density dependent. And so as the density of osprey increased, the acuity in which they feel stressors on the population as a whole can change. And so if you have a very, very low abundance, it may be that the stressor is not of a magnitude that crosses the threshold that amounts to a population loss. But as the population increases, you reach a point where certain thresholds get crossed once certain prey items decline. But ecological systems are very complex, and it's often difficult to understand, to have a one-to-one relationship between population in a region and one particular stressor.
One last comment, Dennis.
And all it is a comment. I noted in one of your slides that striped bass take up 48% of their diet. So we've really gotten to the problem of where the striped bass are going.
Thanks, Dennis. Next question is David Borden.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excellent presentation. I look forward to looking at it in more detail after the meeting when we get the slides of it. I'm just wondering to what extent USGS has looked at competitor populations and the relationship between competitor populations like up our way in Rhode Island, blackback gulls, bald eagles. There's an interaction between them and ospreys, and to what extent have you modeled the different populations to see whether or not that could possibly be having an influence on this? Thank you.
That's an excellent question, and that's work that has yet to be done. It can certainly be done with the resources and the data sets that we have. There are relationships between many species, and you can bear out the correlations between population trends. And then if you can understand the mechanism of the relationship between them, you could start to get to the heart of that. But certainly bald eagles have recovered as well in the Chesapeake Bay region, as have very similar to how osprey have, and they compete for nest locations. And great horned owls have also experience changes in their population, and they prey sometimes on osprey. So it'd be very interesting to look at the ecological interactions between these species as their populations change.
Follow up.
Yeah, just a personal observation. I have a osprey tower of about maybe 90 feet from the house, not mine, if somebody else put it up. And it's amazing how often the bald eagles in the area interact with the ospreys and try to get the ospreys drop herring or menhaden. Same thing goes on with other species like blackback gulls. So I think it's worthwhile to look at that. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Next question is from Representative Gresco.
Thank you. In your presentation, you had some graphs indicating the plateauing or increasing in certain other states at the same time, but they didn't go as far north as New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. And I'm wondering in simple terms, if the potential reason for the plateau or decline of osprey in the Chesapeake area is because they're going north. Because I'm seeing quite a multiple fold increase of osprey even in the district that I represent, and I see it all over in New England. Could that be a factor, and has it been factored in?
It's interesting you bring that up. There's a lot of data pouring in other states besides those around the Chesapeake Bay, and we've heard, at least I have, in media, some issues in other estuaries up the Atlantic coast. One thing to keep in mind is when a pair is formed, a male and female, it's a long-term relationship, and they exhibit nest site fidelity, returning to the same nest and location annually to reproduce. But it is certainly possible that the young might end up in a very different location, and they really don't reproduce until they're 3, 4, or 5 years of age. So it's a little bit of an unknown.
Thank you. Next question is from Marty Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dave and Barnett, for your presentation and your good work. There was a slide you went through pretty quickly. I was wondering if you could bring it back up. It had to do with clutch and fledgling success. And I guess the question when you get to that is, how are those trends, at least as they present today, relate to maintenance rate? That's the right question. And I have a follow, Mr. Chair, if you could after that.
Yeah. Could you just repeat the last part of that, please?
Looking at the clutch success and fledgling success, and I'm not sure this is the right term, maintenance rate to maintain population.
Yeah, well, that number's been around for quite some time, and it has a pretty good scientific basis. It's about 1.15 young fledged per nest. And in the data that I showed from this lower bay, if you look at it, and I'm sorry it's small print, the reproductive rate in the middle column, you see in the 70s and 85, well over 1.15. It's 1.7, 1.4. Then around 2006, 2007, it's 0.8. So that's not a stable population. And then more recently, 2021, it's 0.3, which is very low. And what happens then is birds are moving into that area because it's a sink, essentially, to try to fill in. But they are not doing well. And that's continuing on. And it may be certainly beyond the lower bay. We don't know that and have all that information at this point.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for a quick follow. Just an observation. So having grown up in Chesapeake Bay, worked there for a long time, I looked at some of those trends in the charts, and I flashed back to my childhood when I read Gilbert Klingle's iconic book, The Bay, which I'm always amazed a lot of people have never even heard of. But in that book of vignettes that was captured in the 1940s from Klingle's very detailed observations, he talks about a huge colony in a very rural, undeveloped area near Smith Point, Virginia, a tremendous osprey colony. Now, flash forward to the present day, the anthropogenic impacts throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed, where development is everywhere, including that area that he described near Smith Point. That osprey colony doesn't exist anymore. But upriver at the agency I worked up to through last year in Colonial Beach, Virginia, ospreys are everywhere throughout highly suburban, honestly urban area. And they seem to be doing fine up there. And so it was just an observation. It's interesting how these animals have adapted. And then one last point, you mentioned catfish in some of the diet, in one of the diet slides. It was amazing that in that part of the river where there's lots of blue catfish, they're obviously eating a lot because they're dropping all over the streets on people's cars. They're everywhere. It's so I don't know how they catch the blue catfish, but they do that. So anyway, I did want to thank you and for your presentation.
I have one comment on one thing you said, and it's important to point out that in recent decades, the ospreys have actually moved up the tributaries where historically they were not. And I think that was shown in one of the figures in a map that Brian Watts published. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty. Thanks, Barnett. Next question is from Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Most of my questions have already been asked, and everybody's talked about bald eagles, and I want to remind everybody that the last time we had a discussion about this, Craig Pugh brought up the interaction with bald eagles, which apparently are doing very well in the population. So, but just my only other question would be, in one of your slides when you had the diet composition, in one area it was menhaden and striped bass for 92%, but in the lower bay, which according to your red dots, the fish are not doing that well. I think it was 29% sea trout, 24% menhaden, and 12% croakers. What's the other 35%?
Yeah, that I can pull out of Brian Watts' paper for you. And please recognize that that's a snapshot, 1 year, and what was observed in a series of nests. And there might be different things going on in other areas near there.
Thank you. Next question is Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask your opinion, Dave and Bennett. You said earlier that there was a 1,801% increase in the breeding bird survey population for the Chesapeake Bay. I guess that was in comparison to the earlier time record. Given that, and let's just assume for a moment that the supply of osprey food in the bay has remained relatively stable during that period of time. Is it possible that the osprey population has reached carrying capacity, and that what you're seeing where there's fluctuations the last few years up and down a little bit, it's just random population responses to other factors other than forage? Is that a possibility? Or is there, in fact, in your view, a crisis for the osprey population in terms of its available forage and osprey nesting success? Are we in a crisis mode, or is there a crisis mode in one particular portion of the Chesapeake range of the osprey? Or where are we in that regard, in your view? Thank you.
I think that's right on the nose. That's the question right there. It depends on the scale that you look at. So when you look at the population from the entire United States, or from the eastern region, or the Atlantic coast, or Maryland and Virginia, or just the Chesapeake region, you can draw different conclusions based on what you see from these different data sets. And it certainly may be the case that that localized population that's experiencing food depletion is in a very big nosedive, and it depends on what context and what frame of reference you take that in as to what conclusions you draw from in terms of whether we're in the red zone or we're okay there. In terms of whether the population is plateauing off, well, I often tell people when you're working with these trends at these very large scales, it's not that different than when you're trying to manage your investment portfolio. We all know buy low and sell high, but most of us are not billionaires. And that's because it's easier to tell what the stock market is doing in retrospect when you think I should have bought. And these large data sets like this and these large trends, it can be very difficult to tell in the short time period what the long-term trajectory is going to end up being. So you kind of have to just pick the scale that you're going to focus on. And then, you look at what's happening in that localized population or large regional population, and you make your decisions based on that as to whether or not that's an acceptable loss or not. Barnett, do you want to add to that?
Yes, and that's really the answer to the question that was asked that Dave handled. And you gotta ask yourself, and I hope not to get in hot water, the osprey is not endangered. It's doing very, very well compared to its history, recent history, 50 years. But in some parts of the bay, it doesn't seem to be doing well. And maybe it's just the osprey, or maybe it's sort of a sentinel or ecosystem indicator that things might not be quite as well for some other species of fish-eating birds. And that's something that needs to be determined. Thank you.
This is a fascinating topic, but we do have to move on. So Pat Gear will be the last question. Thanks.
I'm honored. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the great presentation. I just want to follow up on what Dave Bowden was talking about with interspecies competition. We've already talked about bald eagles, but Dr. Watts has done a survey in Virginia for a number of years, going back to, I believe, 1993, which has shown the double-crested cormorant population has increased 1,416% in that 25 years. And brown pelicans have been about 882%. Now, those are species that are primarily piscivores. They're eating, so they're competing for the same food source as well. So, as you said, maybe the nests aren't surviving; they're moving out, and these two species are moving in. Is that possible?
Yes, it's possible, certainly.
Thank you very much for the great presentation, Dave and Barnett. And if there are other questions, I'm guessing you guys will be around for a little while here. So, okay, thank you. And now we're going to move on to agenda item number 5, which is a progress update on the 2025 ecological reference point benchmark stock assessment. I'll turn that over to Katie Drew. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. I'll keep this brief so we can stay on track, but the ERP work group is continuing to work on the assessment, and we are working on bringing in this information from USGS on bird trends into the full model, and we're going to see if we have enough information to do it at a finer spatial scale, but I think that still remains to be seen based on data availability. But that will include both the information on osprey that was presented here in terms of trends and abundance, as well as information from basically the same data sources on other nearshore piscivorous birds like eagles and cormorants, where we can pull these data together. So we're working on that. The single species assessment update continues on pace, more or less. And we will be having our next assessment workshop in the first week of November, the week of November 4th, where we will be having the SAS meet to discuss the assessment update for the first day of that workshop, and then the ERP work group to meet to discuss model runs for the rest of the week. So we are continuing on pace with that, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. That's an amazing effort there. And are there any questions for Katie about this update? Not seeing any. Let's move on to our, excuse me, sorry. Jeff, go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Katie. So I have been listening into the discussions, and you had some pretty positive eagle and osprey data. I think that is going to be part of that consideration. Can you comment on that now, or should we wait until a more full update? But it was pretty positive, and I thought it was important for this discussion that we just had.
Thank you.
So I think it's positive in the sense that we're seeing a lot of the same trends coastwide that we just saw for osprey, which is really just increasing trends in a lot of these nearshore piscivorous birds. Coastwide, I think, the question is, do we have enough additional information on things like diet composition and other vital rates coastwide versus the Chesapeake Bay in order to fully incorporate them into the assessment model? But definitely, I think that we will have better data on these species going into these models this time around, definitely for the full model than we did during the last benchmark assessment.
Thanks, Katie. Okay, that brings us to agenda item 6, a little item that is discuss possible Chesapeake Bay management. And to get this started, I'm going to turn it over to Lynn Fegley from Maryland. Go right ahead, Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate it. And I also want to thank the board for listening. And I very much want to thank the team from USGS for providing us with a wonderful presentation that puts the bird science in context for all of us. So thank you for that. So I'm just going to go right ahead. I am going to make a motion, and Mr. Chair, if I get a second, I would like to speak to it. So my motion is to initiate an addendum to the Atlantic Menhaden Interstate Fishery Management Plan to consider Chesapeake Bay specific management options for the Menhaden purse seine vessels larger than 300 gross tons in order to support the needs of piscivorous birds and fish during critical points of their life cycles. The document should include options for seasonal closures of Chesapeake Bay waters inside the coal regs line. The document should not consider changes to the current bay cap of 51,000 metric tons. The document should also contain options to reevaluate seasonal closures within the bay after 2, 3, or 4 years. The plan development team should feel free to consult with outside experts as necessary to identify spatial temporal patterns of predatory demand for Menhaden.
Thank you, Lynn. We have a motion up and we have a second from Rob LaFrance. So we have a motion and a second, and now I will go to the maker of the motion for further discussion.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. So by this motion, you were asking for the development of options for seasonal closures of the Chesapeake to the largest of the purse seine gears as a precautionary measure to ensure that animals such as osprey that depend on Menhaden during critical points of their life cycle have the opportunity, have as much opportunity as they need to access these fish. In Maryland, we do not believe that this motion addresses just a Chesapeake issue. This unique and essential estuary provides critical habitat for many of the species that we manage and lots that we do not during critical points in their life cycle. In Maryland, we are seeing many signs of stress in our Chesapeake. There are no Menhaden in Maryland. The artisanal stationary gears that Maryland watermen fish are not capturing bait for our crab fishery. We are seeing bottlenose dolphins in unprecedented areas, and we are fielding far too many calls to remove dead dolphins from citizens' shorelines. While we don't lay all this at the feet of the large purse seine fisheries, we believe it is common sense to alleviate stress where we can control it. As we saw from the presentation we just received, bird populations have expanded tremendously in the Bay region. And the demand for forage in the Bay has increased along with their populations. Years ago, when a peer review panel from the Center of Independent Experts convened to review Chesapeake work to examine localized depletion, they said as the abundance of predators continues to increase, their food requirements will also continue to increase to the point where they may become food limited. They also said things like, a stable Menhaden population will not be able to sustain the increasing predator population, and offered to us that time and area zoning of fisheries would be a logical way to mitigate negative impacts. These experts gave the commission a path that at the time we chose not to take. All of this said, this commission has diligently and carefully managed this resource according to the best available science on a coastal level. I am personally extremely proud of the work to develop ecosystem reference points that ensure more conservative fishing levels to leave extra fish in the water. However, I also believe it is hubris to some degree to think that we understand all of the dynamics at play with Menhaden and the animals that depend on them within the Chesapeake. While we can say with confidence that the stock is healthy on a coastal level, we have not been successful in getting the Chesapeake specific science needed to ensure sustainable fishery. We are not asking that the bay cap be changed, and we are not asking that gears of all sizes leave the bay, just the very largest to mitigate the amount of removals. We are also suggesting that any closures be reevaluated in a certain number of years, and this evaluation could be based on new science around Menhaden in the Chesapeake. And to close this up, we feel that this is responsible to start this conversation to look at seasonal closures, and I'm just going to stop and leave it there, Mr. Chair. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Lynn. And Rob, as the seconder, would you like to make some comments?
Just quickly, I just want to point out that this particular management board, the Menhaden Management Board, has been a leader in ecosystem-based management. And I think what we're asking here is to use that vision that we've had for this species and focus that vision on the Chesapeake. We have information from new science that we know about ospreys and the impact of that. And there's a lot of information that needs to be delved into. But to look at time of year closures to help a species that may be in trouble in Chesapeake, given the large amount of output that we've heard from our constituents, I think is very important. I also would argue that looking at the Chesapeake Bay and looking at it in sort of precise terms, we're really looking at the ecological efficiency. We're not talking about changing the bay cap. What we're talking about is possibly changing where and how we take. And I think that's an important element for us to look at. And I think we have some really talented folks in Atlantic States who could really delve into this and give us some really helpful information. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I'm guessing there are a lot of people who would like to make comments. So why don't we do this? If you would like to speak in favor of the motion, would you please raise your hand now so I can write it down? I've got Dennis, Allison, Russell. I'm going around. Who is that? Jeff.
I'm not raising my hand in support. I'm raising my hand to make a motion, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we take a few comments and then I'll come back to you on that. And anybody else that wanted to speak in favor of the motion? Go right ahead, Eric.
Yeah, okay, thank you. How many purse seine vessels are over 300 tons in the bay? How many vessels that actually carry purse seines and fish from a 300 ton or more vessel are there? There's a lot of carriers that are 300 tons, but they get fish from pairs of small boats. So I'm not sure what this actually accomplishes, if anything at all. That's my question.
Lynn or perhaps Virginia, do you have a answer to that question?
I kind of question that myself because our licensing is on for purse seine boats is greater than 70 tons and less than 70 tons. So I'm not sure where this 300 is coming from as well.
Okay, we got some confusion on that. Let me get the hands of those who want to speak against the motion, and then we will start going into comments. I've got Joe, let me see, Joe, Nicola, Pat, and Megan. Anyone else?
Emerson online as well.
Emerson, okay. Okay, I guess we'll take some of these discussion and then we'll go to you, Jeff, for a motion. So let's start with we have Dennis to speak for the motion.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do thank Lynn Fegley for bringing this motion forward. I can't thank her enough for doing it. Having sat on this board since its inception, really, going back over 20 years, how many times have we heard that we should be doing something for the Menhaden. I can remember a gentleman named Jim Price from Maryland used to come to every meeting and give us history on what he felt was going on in the bay with poor health of striped bass and relating it to Menhaden. I think we should take a look at the previous meeting that we just had where we saw that Atlantic herring are in, I'll call it, serious trouble. It wasn't very long ago that we were harvesting over 100,000 metric tons of herring. And this morning we heard that we can be looking forward to harvesting, 783 tons or something like that, some low number. How that all happened, I don't know, but I go back to the canary and the mine situation that we should be getting ahead of this problem. And we've waited too long. I won't dig into the weeds of this motion, but this gets us off the ground and doing something. I think that the people in Virginia and Maryland have been crying to us for years for us to do something for the Menhaden in the Bay. And I think in whole, we've sat back and done very little for the benefit of Menhaden and for the people in the Chesapeake Bay region. Therefore, even though I live up in New Hampshire and don't have a very big oar in this water by any means, I think that the time has come to do something. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. Against, I have Joe Semino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm certainly not against exploring this. I'm against seeing this motion prior to, what Katie talked about and seeing the ERP come out. What's happening in the Chesapeake Bay isn't happening in a vacuum. Striped bass stopped showing up in North Carolina over a decade ago. Coastal Maryland and Southern Virginia stopped seeing coastal migrants of striped bass many years ago, 6-7 years ago. Maryland started showing zero harvest in their MRIP estimates. And it's not just in the fisheries. The winter, which we'll be talking about later today, the winter tagging survey has been moving farther and farther north to find fish. So climate change is real. Weak fish didn't disappear from the Chesapeake Bay. They disappeared from Massachusetts to Florida. So we're dealing with something that we need to take a holistic approach to. The idea that 300 gross ton vessels are, part of the problem, and then, the other end of that is part of the solution. It's not something I'm very comfortable with. So I do hope that as we move forward, because everything is changing, we are in unprecedented times, we do need to take a look at this. But I think we need to get past the ERP and see what happens and take a holistic approach to this. All the literature suggests that Menhaden overwinter off of North Carolina. And so, of course, the Chesapeake Bay would be a very important ingress to where juvenile Menhaden show up. The literature also suggested that some portion was overwintering off of New Jersey. It's very possible that a larger portion of those fish are now overwintering off of New Jersey. And that's why we're seeing a year-round fishery for striped bass in New Jersey. We're seeing the whales year-round in New Jersey. And because of that, we wouldn't expect to see the Chesapeake Bay have the importance that it's had in the past. I think all these things are something that needs to be addressed, and we need to do our best to stay on top of that for the management of all of these species. But I think this is really jumping the gun and very pointed at something that may not be a solution in any way. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Next, in favor of the motion, I have Allison Colden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to express my gratitude as well to USGS for being here and presenting that information. When it comes to Menhaden management in Chesapeake Bay, I'll just go ahead and acknowledge there's a lot of things that we don't know, but there are a few things that we do know. And first of all, and maybe to Joe's point, we do know that the ERPs, as they are currently being developed and worked on, will not address questions in the Chesapeake Bay. Those opportunities are very far off in the future, if they are possible at all. And our attempts thus far to get those studies and those data surveys and other things needed to answer those questions have not been successful or fruitful. And so we know a couple of other things, that we're seeing incredibly fast-paced changes in environmental conditions in the Chesapeake Bay. Our average water temperature has increased. The amount of fish habitat availability has decreased. And this recovery of osprey is absolutely tremendous. But what that translates to is a tremendous change in the predatory demands on the Chesapeake Bay's menhaden population. And that necessitates a reevaluation of our approach to menhaden management in the Bay. So obviously, being around this table, not nearly as long as some others, but this, even for me, is not a new conversation. It's obviously something that this commission has been grappling with for a while, but the conditions that we're seeing now are new and they are unprecedented. Ospreys and other birds are now recovering from those DDT era levels and increasing in abundance. Our large-scale fisheries have contracted to operating in only one state in the same time that those osprey populations have been increasing. So when those menhaden fishing rates were higher historically, they were also more distributed along the coast. We have not seen this overlap in space or time of high avian predatory demand with concentrated spatial harvest in the history of our management of the fishery thus far. And hopefully, I hope it's to say that the predatory demand will be increasing further in the Bay as we work to rebuild and recover the striped bass population. So using, again, osprey as a canary in the coal mine or a signatory species for the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem will only help serve our striped bass rebuilding as we continue to move forward. And lastly, I just want to address, we acknowledge the fact that there may be other factors at play here. I just listed a couple of them for you that our organization, DNR and others are tracking within the Bay. But this board is responsible for managing the menhaden fisheries in the Chesapeake Bay and along the coast. And while we can't possibly address all of the issues facing the Chesapeake Bay, I'll take that on in my day job. And I don't think the public expects us to, but they do expect us to manage menhaden in the way that we have committed to, and that is to be precautionary and protective of the ecosystem that relies on menhaden. And I believe that this motion will have the opportunity for us to open that important conversation, provide opportunities for the public to weigh in, and provide opportunities to address these ecosystem concerns. So I would urge everyone's support, and thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Next opposed, I have Nicola Meserve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't disagree with many of the comments that have been made by supporters of the motion. What I'm struggling with a little bit is the process and diving immediately into an addendum process. The presentation and discussions have underscored the complexity of the issue here. This is a significant action. There's already been questions about the singular focus on purse-seine vessels larger than 300 gross tons. I think the PDT could potentially use some additional direction than what's provided in the motion on the range of strategies to consider. And so I've been thinking about the process that this board took when it began Addendum 2 to look at allocation and the incidental catch provision. And all of that began with a work group, a board work group that discussed the issues and the concerns, that developed potential strategies to address these concerns, outlined the benefits and the challenges of those strategies. And I think that in this instance that would be a better way to move forward at this time to tackle this item. So I'm opposing it just on the basis of wanting there to be another step before we initiate a document. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Next up in favor, I have Russell Dyes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm speaking as a lifelong fisherman on the Chesapeake Bay. We're called watermen, and a pogie fisherman. I have actually worked on a pogie boat and seen what pogie boats catch. I think this we're trying to save the osprey, and we're forgetting about the other predator, which is man. In Maryland this year, we have no menhaden, none. A friend of mine, Robbie Wilson, who has a 3-pound nets set in the bay, his highest catch is a half a bushel, 1/2 a bushel. Maryland has no menhaden. What we need to do, what I had planned to do until Lynn put this motion up, was to ask for a moratorium for 2 years on pogie fishing in the lower bay. This isn't coming from someone who doesn't know it. My brother was a captain of a pogie boat for about 40 years. I fished on a pogie boat. I fished in Britain Sound, Mississippi Sound, and the Gulf of Mexico all the way to Raccoon Point, which is Texas. And I know what they can catch and I know what they can do. But the problem in Maryland is I want to save the creatures, the predators that have 2 arms and 2 legs, because we don't have them, and we can't furnish the fish for the crab industry. Where do you think the fish is coming from for the crab industry? Maine. They're shipping them down from Maine to furnish bait for the crab industry. So look, we can save the osprey, but I want to save our watermen too. And we have plenty of osprey, you know, and I love the osprey. I don't want to see anything happen to the osprey. I want to save our fishermen too. So think about this, because what I had planned to put up here was much more aggressive than this, because we're talking about pogie boats. Let's get down to it. 300-ton boats are pogie boats. They're boats working out of the factories in Virginia. So think about us in the Maryland area, the Chesapeake Bay, because we don't get any menhaden if they don't come through Virginia. So think about it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Russell. And opposed, now we have Pat Gear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A number of factors are affecting osprey. We've already talked about that. You know, huge increases in other bird species that are competing with them for food sources. This motion is basically singling out an industry because of public opinion, in a sense. And it doesn't seem appropriate without the necessary science. You know, we're saying, let's go ahead and try this and see what happens. It's, you know, this motion is leading down a path of a seasonal closure for a fishery based on public opinion. We need the science first. We need to have that information. And, you know, it is very frustrating for us, and it's embarrassing that we can't get the funding to do this if it's that important. And so, you know, I want to see the science done. I want to see the ERP results first. I want to see what's going on with that before we move forward with anything such as this. So, you know, the ERP assessment will come out, and we'll have information from that. We can look at that and see what happens with that first. But, you know, we shouldn't be taking a management action until we have that science from the ERP assessment.
Thank you, Pat. In the interest of time, I know we have a couple more, Megan Ware and Emerson Hasbrook, that wanted to speak against this motion, but we are running up against it. And I know we have another motion that was wanted to be made by Jeff Kalin. So for the interest of time, I'm just going to turn it over to Jeff right now. My apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that this motion be tabled until the ecosystem reference point peer review results are available in 2025. That's my motion.
That would be postponed, Jeff. You okay with changing the wording?
I can postpone it for a time certain, yes, if we're not going to table it. Yeah.
Is there a second to that motion? Okay. I am not seeing a second. Is there a second online, James? No second. So that motion goes away for lack of a second. That leaves us with the main motion. If there's Pat Gear.
I'll make a motion to table this. Motion.
Table would be to consider it in this motion? Would you like to postpone the motion
I don't want to
to
postpone it. I want to table it.
table it till, well, based on the terminology, table would still be coming back to it this meeting. So
At this meeting.
this meeting, so you want to table it?
No, well, it doesn't have to come forward at this meeting. It has to come forward at the next meeting, according to Robert's rule.
Okay. Tony?
Or if there's a 2/3 vote.
Pat, tabling is for just within the meeting. Postpone, you would postpone it to the October meeting. So you just.
Sorry for the clarification on that.
We're getting a crash course in Robert's Rules of Orders here. So we have next motion here is to postpone this motion until our October meeting. We have a second from Marty Gary. Do we have any?
Point of order?
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Is this a debatable motion?
Bob?
The only portion of a motion to postpone that is debatable is the time element. So if somebody wanted to suggest something other than October, that could be debated. But if the part about postponing or not postponing is not debatable.
Thanks, Bob. So I see a hand there from Allison Colden. Did you want to change the time?
No, I have an additional motion.
Okay, based on the rules, do we have to vote on this first? Okay, so this is the motion that must be voted on. So I think we all want a little time to caucus here. So can we have a 2-minute caucus? Okay, we've had caucus time. Does anybody need more time here? Please raise hands if you do. Not seeing any hands, please return to the table. Thank you. Okay, before we take a vote on this, we have a board member who has asked to amend the motion with the legal part of the amendment, which is to change the time.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We just had a discussion of tabling versus postponement, and it's different about how you define Robert's rules, but my intent was to postpone this indefinitely.
So this would be to amend the motion to change the October meeting to postpone indefinitely. Do we have a second for that motion? We have a point of order coming from Mr. Abbott.
Thank you. We have a motion made by Mr. Gear. That motion now belongs to the board. I don't believe that it can be changed at this point.
Oh, I see. So in other words, Pat made the motion that's up on the board right now. So let me go to Bob here. Boy, this is quite a rule of order.
Thanks. Turning into a parliamentarian by default. Yeah, I mean, an individual on the board can amend their own motion. So I don't think Mr. Gear is asking for a friendly amendment here. He's asking to make a motion to amend, changing October meeting to indefinitely.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, so it is a legal motion. We have a second from Eric Reed. Do we need to caucus on this? Because now this is a whole different thing. Instead of bringing it back in October, we'd be motioning to just put this off forever. Does the board need time to caucus? Yes. Okay, another 2 minutes. Okay, does anybody need more time to caucus? It looks like everybody's back at the board. I'm not seeing any hands. Before we vote on this, we do have a hand from online from James Minor of Virginia.
I just want to make sure that
you're unmuted,
I'm opposing this as well. Okay, can you hear me?
James, you're talking, but we can't hear you. So it's going to be your audio settings. If you can make sure that you're choosing a microphone within your audio settings.
Tony, this is Tom Fody. We can hear them online, it's just not getting through to the meeting room.
Okay, 1 second here. We see that you guys hear him online, so let us try to make an adjustment.
Okay, and just a reminder, Mr. Steiner, at this point, the only thing you can comment on is the time.
Tom Fody, if you can make sure you mute yourself, please. Okay, try again, James. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, and I think the chair had just said, as a reminder, you're speaking to the time only.
Okay, I'm okay. Just please proceed with the vote. I'm good now. As long as you all can hear me. I was having I think it was some technical difficulties going on, so I'm here.
Okay, we've had time to caucus. We have a motion to amend on the floor, and let's vote. All those in favor of the motion to amend the motion to postpone, please raise your hand and hold them up there. Okay, put those hands down. And now for those opposed, please raise your hands. Oh.
I mean, online we have Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia in opposition.
Right. So is it 9-9? Okay. So therefore the motion. What? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Are there any abstentions? Are there any nulls? Not seeing any. Okay, the motion fails. It's tied 9-9. So that means the original motion is now the main motion, and that motion is move to postpone until the October meeting. And all those in favor, please raise your hands. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Put your arms down now. I'm sure you get tired. All those opposed to the motion, please raise your hand.
And I also have Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia.
Holy moly. So it looks like the main motion just failed there, right? Oh, well, I meant that's what I meant, not the main motion. I meant the postponed motion. So we have not, our motions to postpone, in other words, have both been defeated. So, are we going back to, instead, I think we have some other motions that want to be made here. Allison?
Just procedure-wise, want to make sure we're back to the main motion now.
We are back to the main motion, yes.
Thank you. Obviously, given my comments earlier, actually, I just need to give you the motion first, don't I? Move to substitute to establish a board work group to consider and evaluate options for further precautionary management of Chesapeake Bay Menhaden fisheries, including time and area closures to be protective of piscivorous birds and fish during critical points of their life cycle. So I did add something to what you had there.
Thank you, Allison. And we have a second from David Borden. And would you like to speak to the motion, Allison?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Obviously, this is something that's critically important to our delegation, and I appreciate all of the supportive comments around the table for the main motion. But I do want to just point out that we hear and are responsive to the other members of the board who have an interest in sitting with this for a little bit longer, but we also want to make sure that if we were to revisit this later on, that we continue to make progress given all of the concerns that we have seen with the Osprey information that was presented, given all the concerns that we hear on a consistent basis from our constituents. And so I wanted to offer the opportunity to continue that conversation so that we can have a continued discussion of this at the October annual meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. David, were there any comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, I don't have much to add other than the fact that I think that's a more logical way to proceed. We'll get back a product that has been thought through, carefully crafted, and hopefully refined. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we've discussed this issue quite a bit, but we do have one person who has not had a chance to really comment on the motions. That is James Minor and Bob has something to say here.
Just briefly before Mr. Minor has a chance to talk, I just wanted to let everyone know that the chair is recognizing James Minor because he is a new commissioner from Virginia, so he's not a member of the public. And I just wanted to let people know that that's his position. That he hasn't been able to attend the meeting, but he is a new commissioner from Virginia.
Great, thanks, Bob, and thank you, and welcome to the board, Mr. Minor, and please go right ahead.
So much. No, I think my hand was just raised. I think there's something going on with this internet, so I'm good. I don't have any comments. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And do we need time to caucus, or what's that? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, we have a comment from Doug Hamans. Doug, you go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
I thought I heard the maker of the motion say something about time area closures in the motion that I don't see on the board. Also, I'm curious as to whether there's a time that this work group should be reporting back to the board. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Bob, I looking at Allison, I think you meant to have some of that in there. Can that be added as a friendly at this point, or is this?
If she said it, and Allison, I don't remember, so I apologize. If Allison said it as she was making the motion and it just differed from what staff had, it's not even a friendly motion. It's just recording what she said, so we could do that. And then I think in her comments, Allison mentioned that we could, the work group could make some progress and bring at least a first report back at the annual meeting.
Okay, so could the motion be modified to reflect that?
Maybe Allison can provide the language about potential spatial and temporal
Yeah,
closure.
would you like me to just read it into the record again from the beginning? Okay. Move to substitute to establish a board work group to consider and evaluate options for further precautionary management of Chesapeake Bay Menhaden fisheries, including time and area closures, to be protective of piscivorous birds and fish during critical points of their life cycle.
Okay, thank you. At this point, we still have the second from Mr. Borden. I think we've discussed this issue quite a bit. Do any of the delegations need time to caucus? And I am not seeing that. So in that case, I'll call out the states. Okay, so want me to just do the roll call? You're going to do the roll call? Okay. Tony's going to do a roll call of the states here. Raise your hand. Okay, all in favor, raise your hands, and Tony will call out the state. All right, go right ahead.
Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Fisheries, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Virginia, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, Maryland, Delaware, Maine, New Hampshire, Florida, South Carolina, Georgia.
Okay, was that unanimous or? Okay, it was not unanimous. Okay, I'm sorry. All those opposed, please raise your hand.
None.
Okay, so it was unanimous. What's that? Yeah, right. Well, I meant, okay. Is anybody abstaining from this vote? Are there any null votes?
Rhode Island.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Eric. I mean, you guys are confusing me. Okay, so now this motion becomes our main motion, correct? And we have to take another vote. So do we need another roll call, or is this just going to be okay. Is there any opposition to the motion? I'm looking at you, Rhode Island. Okay, so we're not having any opposition. The motion passes, and I believe that will end this agenda item, correct? Okay. All right, now we are on to other business. Is there any other business to come before the board? I hope not. I'm not seeing any, so with that, is there a motion to adjourn? And yes, we do have a motion to adjourn, so we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.